Okay. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. My name's Jay Wetter. I'm with the Canola Council of Canada, Communications Manager. So Canola Watch, Canola Digest, and then helping to put together events like this. And then as my job evolves, I'll be helping with kind of some thoughts on innovation and how we can innovate on farms and also through communication and some of the other stuff that we do, processing, et cetera. Okay. What else? So, Sally's long announcements yesterday, well, you're going to get them all again today. So I'd like to just acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. And Sally put together some nice notes for me acknowledging that while we think about canola profitability and productivity, a little Saskatchewan history, it was First Nations farmers from Saskatchewan in the 1880s who, along with settler farmers, were forerunners in summer following for soil moisture retention. Anyway, summer following makes me think of how we've evolved over the years, speaking of innovation and adopting new technology. We don't have a lot of summer follow in Saskatchewan or on the prairies anymore. And then, so we evolved to no-till, and then what's our next evolution? That's something we can think about today and tomorrow. Thank you to our platinum sponsors for this year's event, BASF, Bayer, and Corteva. And also to our gold sponsors, AgWest Bio, Alberta Canola. I'm going to say the three canola groups together. We got Alberta Canola, we got Manitoba Canola Growers, and of course we've got Sask Oil Seeds right here in Saskatchewan. And then we've got Farm Credit Canada and a number of genomes, Genome Alberta, Genome BC, Genome Canada, Genome Prairie, Ontario Genomics, I'm going to assume that's in the same group, NYA Ventures, and then that's it. Oh, and then we go on to the next level. I'm reading as I go. Brett Young, Canadian Canola Growers Association, Cantera Seeds. I should have lumped those two together. And we also got DL Seeds. We got Brett Young, Cantera DL. And then we got Koch Agronomic Services, Syngenta, Blue Sun Scientific, Innovation Saskatchewan, and MNP, which now has an agronomy division. Okay, we're going to be using Slido again for the Q&A. Slido, if you didn't see it yesterday, it's one of the two QR codes on your name tag. The other QR code is the program. So ask a question with Slido, or there's two mics in the room. If you're in the room, we've also got 200 people or so registered for online. So good morning to you too as well. You as well, not you too. Okay, what else do we need? Wi-Fi details on the tent card at the very bottom. Curtis is trying to find it yesterday. It's actually on the bottom of the tent card in that tiny little green bar, the tent card with all the sponsors on it. If you want to tweet, I checked yesterday, there was about 3 tweets, and I think one of them was mine. So Canola Week 2025 is the hashtag. If you're still on X, give it a go, or try it again for the first time. Okay, CCA credits. A lot of CCAs are online. There will be QR codes, one at the end of the morning, one at the end of the afternoon. So there's 2 QR codes for the day today. Or if you're in the room, you can sign up front to get on the sign-up sheet. I think that's it. In lieu of speaker gifts, once again, we will be making a donation to the Friendship Inn in Saskatoon here. All right, that's all of my very long announcements. Thanks for indulging me in that. I'd like to call up Curtis, and Curtis is going to moderate up to the coffee break. Curtis.
Thank you, Jay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for making it out again on what is today a fairly cold morning. Haven't been used to this level of cold for quite a while, so. At any rate, we'll get the session going this morning. That's not me, is it? No. Good call. Yeah, perfect. Yep, anyways. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Gray. Dr. Gray is a professor of agricultural economics and the Canadian Grain Research Policy Chair at the University of Saskatchewan. Richard's research is focused on the economics of crop innovation for the past 20 years. From 2003 to 2014, he led the Canadian Agricultural Innovation Research Network. He has studied the organization and funding of agricultural research in Australia, the UK, and France. Richard also has been involved in many studies examining the rate of return to agricultural research in Western Canada, and he continues to be actively involved in the family farm at Indian Head, Saskatchewan. Professor Gray is going to share with us today his methods for how to assess the return on investment for research. Richard.
Good morning, everyone. In August 1957, Dr. Bill Cram put an article in the Indian Head News, and it said, Roger Gray lost a crop and gained a son this week. And it turns out I was that son, and it was a rapeseed crop that had been devoured by Bertha armorworms after an aerial sprayer had used the wrong insecticide. So canola's really been, or rapeseed's been part of my whole development, if you like, and it just shows that when you're thinking about history, you have to go back a long ways to put the pieces together. Okay, need to figure out how this works. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Curtis. That saves me some time. My objectives today are to discuss how an economist would measure the benefits from agricultural research, including an example from the Canadian canola cluster research. And I want to review some of the large literature on the returns to agricultural research over time and discuss some of the agricultural research funding issues within Canada. Beginning with measuring benefits from agricultural research. Many of you, especially the producers in the room, make dozens, if not hundreds, of investments a year when they decide to buy fertilizer, when they decide to buy a new piece of equipment, etc. Knowledge is different. Knowledge typically takes a long period of investment, and once it creates something, that knowledge is non-rival in the sense that it can be used again and again and again, but it also is very durable. That once a gene is discovered, that knowledge doesn't disappear, that idea stays for a long period of time. So when you're evaluating research, it's really important to take into account the very long periods of time involved between initial research, basic research, applied research, which I think is a lot of the Canadian Agri-Science Cluster is about, that often then goes through a period of commercial development or at least extension, et cetera. Then there's a period of adoption, and then the benefits are out in the sector, and they endure for a long time. There may be other inventions put on top of that. When you're thinking about investment in a particular cluster, you've got a smaller period of time that investments are made, but that one-time investment will create some products which will eventually be adopted by producers and create long, durable knowledge. Because research takes a long time and lasts a long time, and knowledge outputs last a long time, you have to take the time value of money into account. $1 20 years ago is worth $2.60 today. $1 received 30 years in the future is worth about 25 cents. So it's important to take that into account when you're adding up benefits and costs. And if you take those expenditures that I was talking about before, the expenditures, because they occur in the past, are worth more. Those provide a greater cost, and the present value of benefits are diminished going into the future because those benefits occur into the future. And as economists, we do that with a flow of costs and a flow of benefits. We then add up those annual benefits into a sum of the present value of benefits. We add up all the costs as a sum of present value of costs, and we typically reflect that in a single number, looking at the total benefits, the present value of benefits compared to the present value of costs. And I'm sure if you've read this literature, you've seen that done many times. The other thing that's important to consider when evaluating research is that if you do sustained research, one set of knowledge doesn't entirely replace the former set of knowledge. It builds on top of it. So it's cumulative over time. So if you have a sustained stream of research, for example, there's been 4 clusters, we're into the 4th cluster, each one of those clusters create knowledge that is then built upon by subsequent clusters. You can see this in a lot of technologies. You take variety development very often. The genetics in one generation becomes the parents for the next generation, and they accumulate over time. Machinery, you can see the accumulation of knowledge in machinery. Machinery companies seldom throw away a good idea in the next generation. They keep those good ideas from one generation and add them to the next. As a result, these outputs from knowledge accumulate, and they provide a lot more benefits over time, which has to be aggregated and added up. And my friend Julian Alston refers to this, the slow magic of sustained research. Maybe incremental gains, but they accumulate over time and have a very powerful effect on returns and profitability and economic growth over time. One measure of this is something called total factor productivity. It's hard to find up-to-date studies on this since it was discontinued in Agriculture Canada. But if we look at the growth in outputs in Canadian agriculture, we're producing about 5 times the amount of output. This is in 2012. We're producing over 5 times the amount of output with only 1.3 times the amount of inputs. There's far less labor, far less machinery, far less fuel, et cetera, than was in the past. And that increase in the number of units you can produce per unit of cost, if you like, is what drives profitability and economic growth. We don't need as many resources as we used to produce the same quantity of food or canola. It's also evident if you just look at output, that's related to the productivity per unit of land usually, but it's obviously you can, and there's been a very substantial growth in both the value of the production and the quantity of productions over time. About a year ago, I became involved in looking at the agri-science benefit cost analysis. It's the latest round of the agri-science clusters, the SCAP clusters. We required all the clusters to do a cost-benefit analysis for some of the activities that they funded in previous clusters. And typically they want to see 3 activities evaluated within each cluster for those that have the most promise, et cetera. This is going to be part of evidence-based decision-making at Treasury Board. So far, it's been a lot of arguments that research is a really good thing with not enough quantification. They want to see more quantification. I think it's also important to demonstrate the values of research to producers and others that contribute to the funding. And I happen to be involved in 4 of these, including the Canadian Agri-Science Cluster and also the Integrated Agronomy Cluster. I'll just give a call out right now. Michelle Ross is here over there. She's working with me on the Integrated Agronomy Cluster, and we have a survey that we would like you to participate in if there's any agronomists or producers, but I'll get to that later. Any value, excuse me. Maybe I'll get a drink of water in a bit there, Curtis. If you look at the investment in the canola clusters, it's about $20 million per 5-year shot, so it's about $3.9 million sustained funding over a long period of time. So we have to look at those costs compared to the benefits that come out of it. As you all know, the canola sector has grown tremendously over time, from roughly an industry with $2 billion worth of sales to one that's increased to a much higher level. Sorry, that's production. production has increased substantially. I think that's 3 million tons up to about 20 million tons over time. The price, real prices, if you account for inflation, we've seen some recently high prices, but historically they're not really that high. It's more or less constant real prices over time with maybe increasing variability. But if you do some rough math, it's a $12 billion industry right now, which is a very big industry. So small gains in this industry are going to have a large economic impact. And that's just the farm level value at $12 billion. In the Canadian Agri-Science Cluster, this is the previous one, the CAP cluster, there were 7 themes of research. We had to pick among those to look at activities that we could do a cost-benefit analysis on. We wanted those where you could definitely attribute some gains to the research. It was quantifiable gains, and there was evidence of commercialization of those of that research. We settled on 3 of them. The first one is looking at the feed trialing done for dairy rations for canola meal in California. The second is looking at the resistance of clubroot related to that, and the third is a group of activities looking at the management of blackleg resistance within the cluster activities. This research is just getting going, so I'm not going to be able to present any results, but I can tell you that's what we'll be working on. It's important, I think, that 2 of those are diseases. Diseases are something that often gets neglected when we're looking at research, but canola has a few of them that are major threats. Sclerotinia continues to be an issue, clubroot, blackleg, and verticillium stripe is a new one, and there's also some insect pests that are now becoming issues. And we've seen some instances of these diseases over time that have an impact on yield. When you're looking at disease management, it isn't just genetics. There's a process that happens. It's almost like clockwork. You have to identify the pathogen. You have to develop diagnostic protocols. You start to look at what agronomic management, how that might help. You need to then start looking at the germplasm, figure out where the resistance lies within that germplasm and how it reacts with the pathogen. You need to do some genetic mapping, usually through GWAS, to develop markers for those genes. You need to deploy those genetics through breeding, also in agronomy and extension to help the management. And then you need ongoing surveillance and mapping, sometimes to invoke an agronomic response. All of those things happen within the Canola Council, and certainly within the knowledge as often comes from the cluster research. In terms of economics, disease management protects yield. That's pretty obvious. And you need to sustain an investment in there if you want to manage those diseases, because they will develop resistance, they will develop, new diseases will develop. It's a continual process. So let's consider a hypothetical case, and again, we haven't done the analysis. Let's consider that the work of the canola cluster results in maintaining or improving yield by 1% over time. So yields are going to be 1% higher going well into the future relative to where we are today because we're doing the research. And then we have to think about the economies of scale. This is a $12 billion industry. A 1% of $12 billion is $120 million. That's an annual benefit that's received each year. If you compare that to the annual costs of the cluster of about $4 million a year, or 3.9, it's a 30-to-1 benefit cost ratio right off the bat. That's only for 1% protection of yield, which isn't very much. And you know, I think this is a message for the researchers in the room as well. If any one of them can come up with an idea or some knowledge that's going to increase canola yields by 1% for just 1 year, that's enough return to pay for cluster activities for 11 years, even if it takes 20 years to get there. So that's an amazing return because of the size of the canola industry, which is an advantage that this sector has at this point. So this was just a conservative hypothetical example, but it does illustrate that even small changes in a big sector have large economic impacts and provide a good return to research. If you look at that in dollars per acre, the $3.9 million a year only represents 18 cents an acre for producers, roughly. And a 1% yield increase is $5.55, roughly. So again, they get a 30-to-1 benefit cost from this type of hypothetical increase. Now, shifting to general returns agriculture research, it turns out that even this hypothetical case with canola research is not an outlier. In fact, there's been many, many studies, literally thousands of studies that have looked at the costs and benefits of agricultural research. Hurley did a study in 2016 where he did a meta-analysis where he took 2,600 estimates that existed of return in the literature, and the average benefit cost ratio was 59-to-1 across that 2,600 examinations of return to research. Alston et al. Had a very long time series. He looked at U.S. ag research going back to 1850 at every state level and at the federal level, and he found a 32-to-1 benefit cost ratio of research, with the maximum impacts of spending $1 today being actually 25 years in the future. But if you think about the development plus the adoption, that's reasonable. Groenwegen and Thompson looked at peas and lentils, found 26-to-1 and 49-to-1 benefit costs for peas and lentils, respectively. Awada, myself, and Cecil Nagy looked at the benefits of zero-till and found a 61-to-1 benefit cost ratio. Again, not surprising for those producers that are implementing these technologies. You can see the benefits from doing that. Other studies that have been involved in looked at pulse growers 20-to-1, barley 27-to-1. Again, these are typical rates of return. They're not exceptional. But those high rates of return also beg the question, why aren't we doing more if the returns are like that? So if you look at who benefits from agricultural research, you certainly have producers benefit through lower costs, increased output, and higher land values. Domestic and foreign consumers also benefit. When you produce more of a crop in the world, even if you depress the price a little bit in the world, that's a benefit to consumers. And that needs to be taken into account. The owners of knowledge can certainly benefit. In this cluster, particularly in canola sector, a lot of the genetics that are developed are incorporated into varieties that are protected with patents and hybrid technologies, allowing companies to capture some of those benefits with some of it spilling to producers. The rule of thumb is more or less 1/2 going to producers, 1/2 to these technology owners. Input suppliers can also benefit, whether they're selling fertilizer or other things. Taxpayers also benefit through economic growth that development of increasing GDP has. And citizens also improve through improved environment. If you look at the impact on carbon sequestration or biofuel, canola's had an impact there as well. When thinking about funding research, it's important to think that not all types of research are the same. We don't produce the same type of goods. If you're looking at, and we like to think of private goods, industry goods, and public goods, if you look on your left, the private goods are those goods that can be protected by intellectual property. If someone owns the idea, if you like, for a period of time, they can capture value from that idea by selling a product or that allows them to make a commercial venture out of investing that knowledge. So certainly we protected traits, variety traits, protected production processes in processing, patentable mechanical innovations, another place where you see private sector investment, chemicals, pesticides, again, large amounts of private investment. And to some extent, product and market development. If you have a commercial company that has a brand name, they can benefit from developing, putting some research into making higher quality products. Then there's public goods. Those are goods that are non-excludable, meaning that once knowledge is created, it leaks out, gets disseminated, spills over to the whole sector. But more than that, public goods are those that provide a general public benefit. Okay? You can think of those as, you know, basic science, chemistry, biology, science, literature, etc. And the third category are industry goods. Those also ideas that spill out. If there's an agronomic breakthrough in canola and your neighbor does it, pretty sure you're going to be able to adopt that as well without paying necessarily for that knowledge. And the difference between an industry good and a knowledge and a public good is that industry goods mainly benefit people within a sector. So who has the most interest in developing better canola varieties? It's people in the canola sector. It's not necessarily somebody that you know, lives in Ontario and doesn't grow canola, doesn't eat canola products. That's different. And industry goods are useful because producers can play a big role in this space. They're part of the industry and they control checkoffs and levies. And it's also how some of the industry goods are funded as well. That industry contributes to the funding through levies, but also that supply chain benefits from the output. So you have three potential funders: private firms, these producer industry funding, and government. And ideally, you'd want to see basically governments funding public research, private firms funding private goods, and producer organizations funding those industry type goods where they have a strong interest in doing so. But that's not where we are in Canada. If you want to look at the research structures in Canada and where we're at, there's three reports worth looking at. There's the AIC report that's done 2017. Both CAPI and Farm Credit Canada have put out new reports this year. I've used some of this background. So if you look at what's happened in Canada, governments play a very large role, and they produce everything from public goods to private goods, what could be produced by the private sector. Producer organizations are closer to the commercial end, and the private firms play a role in the production of private goods, particularly canola varieties and chemicals, etc., those protectable items. If you look at research funding, I guess that's on your left. You have government spending. The provincial, federal government adds up. This was in 2015-16. Hasn't changed very much since then. $649 million a year, but that includes food and agriculture. It's a long stretch. And then you look at private agriculture funding. It's gone up over time, but it's only $73 million a year, and this would be in agricultural-related funding, wouldn't include mechanical innovations. But typically, we're very heavily reliant on government funding in Saskatchewan, and certainly levies and producer checkoffs have helped a bit, but they don't compare to that $649 million. And more than that, those investments have been flat over time in real terms, while the sector has grown considerably. So we've seen crop receipts literally go from 10 billion to 50 billion a year. And if you look at how research intensity has changed, how much are we spending per dollar of income, there's been a precipitous drop over time. This shows up in the FCC report. And we went from being way above the OECD in terms of research intensity to being actually less than the OECD average, which is a striking decline over a long period of time. All we did was keep research constant, but as the sector grew, we didn't keep up with that growth. So this has implications. There's a large body of evidence that says research investments are good, sector's growing, but we haven't invested more dollars in that. Despite that, if you look at public investments, more or less flat. Producer levy investments, they had a little bit of an uptick, but now they're locked in because of their levy rates. And they certainly haven't kept up with agricultural growth. They've been a source of agricultural growth, but they haven't actually reinvested that at the same rate. And if we look at, sorry, I'm just having a look at the time. So in 1980, research investment was over 2% of agricultural sales. Now it's less than 1%. So we're not keeping up with the growth in the industry. As we've got better off, we're growing, we're not reinvesting that money at the same rate. FCC has done some projections looking at productivity growth per decade. And what they show in their figures, the dark blue columns are agricultural productivity, average annual productivity growth by decade, beginning with 1961 through to 2000, a projection to 2021 to 2030. And we can see a large increase in productivity growth during the, particularly the 2000 to 2010 period, but also during the 90s and the last decade. But there's been a decline in the rate of growth according to their analysis. I'm not fully convinced of a decline in the rate of growth, partly because I think drought has contributed to some of that tailing off. And I think, but I do think that some of the initial impact of hybrids, which created a huge impact, some of the effects of zero tillage, once that transformation is made, it doesn't drive the same rate of growth over time. So you can kind of expect this, but it also suggests and begs that question, are we putting enough in the input side to maintain that growth on the output side? And if we maintain the current level of investment, it's not a disaster in terms of the sector isn't going to collapse or anything, but we're missing an opportunity. If there's 20-to-1 benefit cost ratios from investing in research, it makes sense that we would be continuing to invest at the same rates as we did before, which, again, hasn't kept up with the growth in the sector. And Farm Credit argues that for agriculture in total in Canada, there's about $30 billion in additional value that's being lost by losing our rate of productivity growth in the agricultural sector. And it doesn't really matter whether productivity growth is dropped or not as to whether we should invest more. The same would apply even if we were having a great rate of growth right now. We'd want to invest more to accelerate that rate of growth. And if you talk to any scientist, any breeder, they will say, if I had more money, I could have a larger program, I could have more counter-season breeding, I could be having a larger GWAS panel, there's things you can spend money on that would improve the output of your research and the performance of what you do. So there is a reason that you might want to invest more than you currently are. So is the lack of funding a producer problem or a government failure? It would be a good question to ask. And I think it's a little bit of both. I think there are options to increase funding. One would be to improve property rights to bring in more private research. In consultations that happened a few years ago, producers kind of rejected any model that was out there for increasing royalties. And the second problem is that there may be a structural problem in the current levy structure in that they're fixed at a dollar amount over time, and inflation erodes those the capacity or the spending, the amount of research that those dollars will be able to support. As for government, they're increasingly cash constrained, and I think they're increasingly reluctant to fund research where the private sector may be able to do it, but they're kind of stuck in the sense that some of the moves we need to make to provide more incentives aren't there. And we're in a situation now where some of even the flagship breeding programs are being resource constrained, and that doesn't make sense from if you like, a benefit perspective. The other thing I'd like to point out is that it's not that governments are not spending a lot on agriculture. This is expenditures on different types of agri-recovery. In fact, it's payouts, and some of that is producers getting their own premiums back. But there is a very significant case of crop insurance, 60% government share of contributions. So a lot of these are government dollars. And I don't know whether you can read the axis, but those crop insurance payments hit $3 billion a year, which is a lot more than what governments are spending on research. So money is getting allocated. There is partly that allocation happens by the way the programs are designed and the matching that takes place and the program design. But it's also the case that we don't have something similar. Research is always something that comes up as a discretionary part of the budget, which I think may be a bit of an issue. I think there are options for improving the level of funding. Australia is probably the flagship example of this. They're not facing a funding crisis in agricultural research. In fact, they're growing their research as we speak. Producer-controlled nonprofit research development corporations play a big role in Australian agriculture. They're funded with a 1% levy on all on agricultural sales, and grains in particular is 1%, matched 0.5% by the government. So that means they've got 1.5% of gross sales that they can, gross grain sales that they can put into grain research, and it's, I'm going to say $200 million a year, but it's actually hit $280 million in the last couple of years. It's a lot of money that they have to allocate. They are very much driving that research system, and so there is ways to create greater pools of money, and a contribution of 1% of gross sales, it may sound like a lot, but if you're going to get even 1% out of that ever, it's not a bad investment. It's high returns. Secondly, once these funds were established, these producer-controlled organizations purposefully developed breeding corporations where they were shareholders, governments are shareholders, and with some private shareholders. And those two, AGT is one of them, Intergrain is the other one, the two large public producer-private partnerships that exist in Australia. Monsanto pulled out of Intergrain, so it's just a producer-public process. But these breeders are funded because they introduced endpoint royalties. Producers pay about $4 an acre, which for the $4 a ton, for the products they sell, which doesn't sound much, but it provides another $160 million worth of revenue that can be reinvested in breeding and other activities. So Australia's developed a model where there's a lot more money that is not as dependent on governments as we are today. I think that's more sustainable. I can't see all of a sudden government tripling what they're going to do in agriculture. So it's going to be a gap. In conclusion then, I'm going to kind of push my way through this because I wanted to save some time for questions. Agriculture research investments take time, but they produce long periods of cumulative benefits, typically with very high benefit cost ratios. Given the very large size of the canola sector, even small incremental change has huge economic impacts. It's just a great place to park investment. there's a need in Canada to create space where the public, producers, and private firms have an incentive to invest in research, because there's those public goods, those industry goods, and those private goods that all need to be fed to develop that innovation continuum. And finally, we have to acknowledge there's maybe a funding crisis in agricultural research. When things were tough in the 80s and 90s, we were investing a higher percentage in research than we are today, when there's more wealth out there than there was before. It's sort of, you would think it would be the other way around. As producers have had a few good years, it's like, how can I maintain this? But I think we failed to do that. So I'm going to wrap it up now. I'm going to give before I open for questions, as I mentioned, Michelle and I are working on the benefit costs for the integrated agronomy cluster that produces a lot of products that agronomists and producers use, to anything from forecast maps to other tools. And the only way we can value that, we know that the tools exist, the only way we can value that is to get some indication of how they're used by agronomists and producers. And so if there's anybody out there that is an agronomist or a producer, we'd encourage you to respond to this survey. There's a scan code on the screen. I can leave that there if you want. Take a picture of their phone. And Michelle, put up your hand again. Michelle will be around, and she can certainly hook you up with the survey. So with that, I'm going to open up questions for my presentation, and I'm sorry about my unabashed proposition in the scan code. So.
Right on. Richard, it's Jay here.
Yeah.
I've got a few questions on Slido. In the room, if you have a question, please just go up to the mic and we'll find you. But you just said there's a funding crisis in ag research. That was one of your concluding statements. And so there's a question here that fits with that. Is research underfunded right now because of the economy and money is tight, or is there a greater reason? If so, what is it?
I'll refer back to some of the, it's a combination of things. I do think that producers are constrained by the tools they have to pay for more research. If there's no royalties and levies are stuck at a very low percentage of gross sales, those contributions are limited. Governments certainly are cash constrained. There's a lot of demands for that, but this didn't occur overnight. This is something that's been constant for a long period of time. And I think that's partly due to the government having this notion that maybe we can use our tax dollars and focus on things like basic research and education, et cetera, where government needs to be involved, defense being another one, and have stronger property rights and other things that would take over the commercialization process of a lot of goods. So I think it's both. The private firms, I think, they need incentives to be able to do that. They need a revenue source. Interestingly, in Australia, you would think with these two producer public firms with that it would have crowded out all the private breeders, but there isn't. There's 4 active private breeders in Australia because there's a royalty model there that they don't need a big market share to be able to support a breeding program. So there is ways to do that. In the canola sector, fortunately, they've had a lot of private investment, in part because they had hybrid technologies and patentable traits that gave them those strong property rights. But it doesn't exist generally, and you're never going to have those strong property rights for something like agronomic knowledge. If you can see what your neighbor is doing, it's easy to figure out, I should be planting the same day. You can't hide those things. That's going to spread. And you don't want to necessarily contain a lot of the concept of basic science. You want to spread those ideas around because they can be used everywhere. So that's the answer.
Just to follow up on that, so the GRDC, if that's the right
Yeah.
acronym, in Australia. I think, did you say it had $200 million a year, maybe 280?
Yeah. So this is the Grain Research and Development Corporation.
And that's covering all crops, so it's
Covers
not
all
sector
crop.
specific.
Yeah.
Like in Canada, we've got lots of pots of money.
Mm-hmm.
Researchers have to spend a lot of time applying for within all these. Do you like that GRDC model? Like, do you think that's something that we could borrow?
There's a lot of aspects I like about the GRDC model. Partly it's the fact that they have a presence as well in in producing some of those private goods that can compete. The sustainability of funding is there in their case. If that, as the industry grows there, they're going to, they've managed to get a lot of revenue. And not only that, because they're shareholders in these breeding firms, if there is any return, which they can reinvest those returns. They're shareholders, so they get some of those returns that can be reinvested. So there's a lot I like about the model.
What don't you like about it?
That's a good question. I do think they spend a lot of resources having to defend the levy, if you like, which is okay. You have to do some of that, but I think there's also, they have a lot of local research projects, which that is very much producer directed, but in many cases it's reinventing the wheel. That result is already known. They're duplicating that research just so that the local producers can be reminded that's the results. And so there's a bit of that, I think, but overall I think it's a good model because it provides that sustainable funding that grows with the sector.
Well, here's another Slido question. So earlier in your talk, Richard, you talked about research kind of, it's not like something new, it's often building on existing research. We're getting sort of incrementally smarter.
Yeah.
But sometimes we have studies, and I think you and I talked earlier, and you used the word dry hole, which I love. And you can explain what you mean. But here's the question. Where does research that proves something does not work or is limited to certain environments fit in the analysis? How do you cost or provide a benefit to something like that?
That's a good question. I think when it comes to agronomic knowledge particularly, and you start thinking about what's the best way to manage this this disease or yield or other things that you maybe have an objective, those best management practices almost by definition have ruled out what doesn't work. And by having scientific replication and evidence to support that knowledge, you're not collecting a bunch of opinions about what increases yield. You actually have data to support that. And that's really important because you can't have, it becomes very costly if producers have to learn whether something's any good on their own. It's much more efficient to do the testing in multi-years replicated trials before it gets to that point. So that's part of what, cluster activities, et cetera, do as well. They hone in on those things that work.
I set you up with the dry holes comment. Can you explain it? Because I think it's important that we remember that we're going to fund projects that actually don't produce a result we can use. But that doesn't mean it was necessarily a waste of money. It's still important to try.
Yeah, I mean, there's different types of dry holes. There are things that people have a hypothesis that they want to test. They have an idea. Maybe seeding earlier is a good idea. They try that. It doesn't work. That's probably a poor example. But there are things that we reject all the time. In the case of breeding, sometimes a breeder will make a cross that actually never gets commercialized, but because that variety has particular traits that they wanted to put in there, it gets used as a parent in subsequent breeding. So in that case, what appears like a dry hole, in fact, isn't a dry hole. But it's also important, I guess, particularly for producers in the room and the researchers, you have to be bold when you're doing research. If you want to discover big things, you have to have big ideas, and some of those big ideas are going to be wrong. So when you're looking at whether you want to fund some bad ideas, you would say, well, I don't want to fund bad ideas. But if you want to fund good ideas, you have to fund them together. And some of them are going to provide results that are going to provide huge benefits, and others are going to be dry holes. So I think it's important not to micromanage science. Research is a process of discovery. We don't know what the outcome's going to be. And if we did, it's not research. And so I think it's important that we sort of give that latitude to say, yeah, we're going to make some mistakes. Some of the knowledge isn't going to be useful. But if we look at the cluster funding for $3.9 million a year, there's 70 research activities that are going on, or 50, and some of those are going to produce valuable knowledge. And that's all you need. You don't need them all to produce valuable knowledge.
We got time for one more, and I can run the mic if so. Yeah, you got one? Okay, perfect. You got it. Okay, thanks.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. What would you say has caused that drop in private sector funding?
I think there were certainly some decisions of some of the major corporations to move some of the research activities to the U.S. That would be part of it. But I think more generally, Canada's always relied on the public to a large extent for research, even producing goods that could be private. And they do that in part because we have pretty weak intellectual property rights when it comes to, say, wheat varieties or pulse varieties, where once a variety is produced, immediately another breeder can use that as an input. So some of that knowledge stock becomes someone else's. And secondly, producers can reuse seed, which again reduces it's great for producers, but in terms of a financial incentive to create the next variety is a problem. A good example we've run into is in the UK. They've got several small, I'm going to say large companies with small breeding programs in the UK. And they have a huge disease resistance issues, and they seem to be consistently failing to create sustained resistance to fungal diseases. In talking to the breeders, they say, if I make a 10-year investment in improving a variety and stacking some resistant traits in there, maybe take 15 years to do that, my competitors can take my variety as soon as it's commercialized, or maybe even pre-commercialized, and breed with it. So I'm competing against my own knowledge before I know it. So why would I spend 10 years if I can copy someone else's idea in 2, so the research doesn't happen? So, you know, you can create incentives that way that complicate the, or reduce the incentives for private research.
Just a follow-up question there. What would you say then would be a good solution for Canada to kind of increase maybe that private sector funding?
I think first of all, looking at where the private sector certainly can excel, and I think that's partly some of the regulatory hurdles for some products are much higher than others. I think there's a good reason why the private sector funding was required to sort of have the takeoff in canola. That would probably be true in some of the machinery industry and development. But I would also say that some of the real breakthroughs in machinery technology hasn't started in the big companies. It's usually smaller enterprises, et cetera. So I think you have to balance that and provide incentives not only for, you know, patentable stuff, but incentives for, I'm going to say, smaller projects and research activities that can feed and develop ideas pre-commercialized.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks again for that compelling presentation, Richard, and lots to think about. It's, for those of you who know me, this is something that I'm incredibly passionate about, identifying big ideas, attracting funding, and then looking at the value of that research. And it's, we have a lot, there's a lot of good info that's going to come out of these studies. And I think it's really going to be a strong reflection. We have $12 million to produce, or we're $12 billion. We're a $43 billion industry. This has all happened because of all of the innovation, all of the dollars that have been put into research over the last number of years. It's the like I said yesterday, it's the only thing that drives, innovation drives our valuation, and innovation comes from strong research, and some of those research projects are incredibly useful, but they don't always get the sort of the return on investment that an investment banker would look for, like the hurdle rate, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't driven significant economic gains in Canada. And so understanding that entire interplay is what part of this science cluster research analysis is looking at. And we look forward to sharing those results as they evolve over the coming years as well. Okay, moving on. I'd like to welcome to the stage my colleague, my Canola Council colleague, Canola Council of Canada colleague, Chris Manchur. Chris is the Manager for Research, Innovation and Resilience, and Chris is going to continue our research ROI theme and by describing a few of our significant research projects over the years, projects that have helped canola farmers improve their productivity and profitability. Chris.
Okay, first off, I'd really like to thank Richard for starting off this session here. I don't know if we unknowingly collaborated on some of these slides, because there's going to be a few things that have definitely kind of spilled over in terms of a lot of the speaking points that I'd like to kind of touch on. But I think it's really worth reiterating, the value of this research and innovation that we're seeing both in the public and private areas and all that. And I'm sure we're going to be having some of these conversations as we kind of move forward into later of today's discussions as well as into tomorrow's as well. So kind of giving a kind of overview of what I'm going to talk about today, we're going to be taking a look at a bit of a macro and a micro level in terms of where research and innovation has kind of really impacted our canola industry. Taking a look at what some of our past successes have been, where are some of the current limitations in terms of applying this research and innovation and the overall economic and environmental challenges we've been having. And then also kind of tying it back to the farm gate, where we can kind of take a look at some recent producer publicly funded initiatives and projects that have actually produced a quantitative, measurable return for that. And I think Richard really did a good job of talking about, even if we're getting a 1% protection in yield or a 1% increase in yield production, that little bit has a massive return on the broad context across all of our canola industry. So some of this stuff may not be too much of a new information for a lot of us here, because we're all deeply immersed into this canola world, but innovation is canola and canola is innovation. And just highlighting the past, over the past, say, 30 years or so, we've seen, or even further back when we're talking about the non-nutritional components, the urucic acid, glucosinolates, being removed to create canola what it was from rapeseed, herbicide resistance for weed management and rotational benefits. So we had a really good discussion yesterday on the weeds panel about the value of canola being that cleanup crop and offering that good farm benefits. Adaptability to our Canadian prairie climate. So we've seen, we've been bringing that yield floor upwards in terms of major drought loss events. We did have one significant year, but if we didn't have that adaptability, it may have been even more significant. And then also probably one of our major focus areas here, and we've kind of heard it time and time again, but taking a look at disease resistance. We have, kind of 4 major diseases, or clubroot, verticillium, blackleg, sclerotinia. And we've had a lot of work on the genetic resistance to actually protect against some of these major threats. So where has that really left us in terms of production and where canola has really come from in the past, say, almost quite 30 years on this chart? It's significantly increased in, say, in the 2000s, right up into the point where we're kind of getting within these past kind of 5 years or so, where we've kind of seen that kind of plateau. Now that plateau, maybe it's maybe we're breaking that a little bit this year, so we're waiting with bated breath for some new information on those yield results. But we've definitely had kind of a bit of that stagnation recently in terms of productivity. So there's definitely other factors that were contributing to this, and of course, we're going to touch on some of this here in terms of, well, drought, of course, right? We want to definitely acknowledge that the environment plays a very major role in terms of setting our yields, what our absolute maximum yield potential is. You know, really at the core, what are the main components for agricultural production? It's the sunlight, the soil, and the water. And if we don't have one of those major components, that's going to be a major limiting factor. But it doesn't tell the whole story, and I think that's important that we need to also realize we want to try and decouple some of the other yield limiting factors or the productivity factors. And sometimes that is looking at the lagging adoption of practices and technologies. So kind of tying it back to what Richard was talking about, how we have the research and innovation continuum and how we conduct that research, and then there's going to be an adoption phase where we're doing that extension and the realization of those impacts. And so right now I'm just picking on, say, fertility here through our agronomy survey and our grower survey that's conducted every couple years. We have seen significant progress, you know, even if we're taking a look at between 2020 and 2024, where the amount of soil testing to be able to set our fertility recommendations and ultimately set our yield potential and our yield targets for there has been improving. But even then, we're still around that 60% of either a farmer soil testing either every year or every other year for that. And then the other flip side too, we've seen a decrease in terms of the percent of growers that are having the same fertility program for all fields on their farms. And so recognizing, we've probably talked earlier about, you know, in the 4R about, you know, all these different kind of advantages for that, and the right rate for the right area is very important. And so we've seen decreases there for that. And these are kind of areas that we can kind of take a look at to continue the extension to realize these benefits, and that will help improve that productivity. Now, kind of one of the main focus areas here we're talking about is, yes, declining research investment. And so some of this information probably won't be too new. I've kind of positioned it in maybe a different perspective as Richard has, but it's some of the same data sources for that. But whether it's a stagnating in our current economy right now, which if you're accounting for inflation is that decline, we're seeing that we're not kind of investing into that future, whether it's in the government, the public, the private, we're all seeing those kinds of impacts. So earlier this year, there was a study commissioned by the Dean's Council of Agriculture and Veterinarians, and they took a look at all the kind of research investments that we're seeing, and I'm kind of comparing here two different areas. One is the Tri-Council funding, so looking at the NSERC, SSHRC, CIHR, so this is funding our academic institutions, and then also on the other side for AFC investments too. So we're taking a look here, like there is some general trends we could probably pull out from here in terms of overall investments. I don't know how well those small numbers appear up on the slide screen here, but overall we're seeing that there is a kind of a relative decline here, and this is adjusted without inflation as well. On the AFC, we do see there was kind of some major spikes here. 2018, right in the middle, that was the start of the Canadian Agricultural Partnership Cycle, but we've seen some significant declines too, as well as, you know, as we're kind of thinking about the COVID pandemic and the tightening of the budgets there. So, but we really haven't seen any recovery for that yet. And then we also see that there's kind of a reflection of that in terms of overall government mandates across departments of looking at a 15% cut. So if you're looking at a 15% cut, one of the more reasonable areas to achieve that is to kind of stop any future investments for that. So one other thing I'd like to just touch upon here on this slide too is that we've also had a refocusing of some priorities as well, where we're taking a look at environmental stewardship investments as well that produce some really good tangible benefits to the taxpayers, broader society as well. However, this may be happening rather than as an additional investment, but as a component of the overall investment that we're seeing currently today. So when we're taking a look at, say, in terms of overall productivity, increasing yields, or protecting yields from some of our major threats, if it doesn't fall maybe underneath the environmental stewardship angle of that, it is then a net decrease. So especially on today and throughout a lot of our conversations, and just pulling up a bunch of different articles here, and this is all within the past year. This isn't a new concept that we've probably been discussing in terms of, trying to drive more innovation, trying to drive more investment, showing that agriculture is an economic powerhouse for our industry and throughout Canada as well. There's a lot of opportunity that we can see. We've seen, Richard, you mentioned there's a few reports even this year as well from groups such as FCC, CAPI. They have some great webinars to actually communicate some of this value. And I think it's really important, especially in a critical period here. Although it's, the end of 2025 right now, we see that in 2028 will be the next policy framework that a lot of our major programs are funded through, say, the Canola Agri-Science Cluster, as well as other funding mechanisms that seek to leverage, say, producer dollars and also private investments as well. And so I think it's really important that we kind of set the stage here and continue to communicate a lot of these important values and also show that we've had some major successes, good returns on this, and advocate for that greater investment across the board, not only to the government, but also to our industry base, to our grower base as well, because this helps increase things and promotes better successes in the future. So this is a bit of a busy slide here, but I'll give you all a bit of time to take it in. This was adapted from the Agri-Food Innovation Council's report in 2017, just positioning it to be a little bit more canola focused in terms of where our major players are. So we can kind of separate it into kind of three major categories. We have our funders that are providing the dollars and investments. We have the performers who are actually conducting this research. And then also I had it along the bottom, where is that innovation continuum? And where are kind of the major areas, and showing kind of like where the responsibilities of some of the performers, adopters of this research kind of falls under. So it's, I probably could have cleaned it up a bit, but if you look at these charts, you see that they say the federal, provincial governments. So you can consider this whether it's AFC or as a broader group, because there's many different departments, whether it's AFC, ICED, and beyond that fund agricultural research, combining it with the provincial governments that fund all aspects of this continuum for their performers, whether it's at science and technology branch, our academic institutions, as well as agribusinesses that could be major corporations that are multinational, smaller enterprises, even startups. There's different funding opportunities in areas that we can invest for that research. And then also, additionally, there's nonprofits and industry organizations. So that could be the Canola Council or producer groups, provincial ones as well. And that's taking a look at the extension and evaluation. And that's where I kind of think about we heard in our research updates at the end of yesterday about the on-farm research trials to validate this in true agricultural farming context for that. So what I really want to kind of take a look at here is try and focus in on what is the kind of our industry kind of perspectives in terms of where, say, the Canola Council as well as maybe our producer groups would be funding along this innovation continuum. And a lot of that occurs in the basic and fundamental research area as well as in the applied research realm. So we've talked about, applied research, especially being in the context of our Canola Agri-Science Cluster, but is also very complementary in the basic and fundamental research realm as well. And rather than kind of considering it as a separate kind of entity on both sides, they do kind of occur along the same kind of spectrum here, and that one plays into the other to develop these products, technologies, these knowledge-based outcomes that then you could look at in-field applications. So just going to kind of taking a look at what are the differences between basic and fundamental research versus applied research. Basic and fundamental research is providing that foundation to develop these new ideas and understandings that maybe we could take into the applied world where we apply it into a specific context or potentially a certain production system like canola, or you can even go into a pathosystem of a specific disease. So in the fundamental research, we do want to broaden that knowledge base and develop these theoretical or exploratory projects that actually gives us enough of an idea to generate these hypotheses, generate this understanding that then we can take these concepts and apply them into a process that can develop an outcome. and that outcome can then be developed further and then applied in the, into a product or a knowledge item. So in terms of, when we're taking a look at the investments for this, when we're investing into it, and Richard touched on this too, is like it is a little bit high risk because the time horizon is going to be further on. And when we're taking a look at, say, a portfolio of research investments, you do want to have something here where we're taking a look at the horizon goals. What do we want to actually explore upon? And you may want to cast a little bit wider net in the hopes that we find something a little bit maybe more revolutionary or changing that could result in a much higher ROI, but it will be longer term. So some of the examples of this is, elucidating some of these disease resistance mechanisms that then could be applied in certain contexts, looking at those molecular basis, discovering nutrient use efficiency molecular pathways. There's been work, trying to create a symbiosis to have nitrogen fixing canola. Those are the kind of ideas, understanding the biological processes of the plant versus the microbe and seeing if there's an ability to interact. And then once you develop that understanding, you could apply it to try and have, say, canola fix nitrogen. And then the other side for applied research, it's integrating these resistance genes into, say, your germplasm, proving that it works in those sense that you can actually generate that product of a hybrid cultivar at the end, or selecting for your canola lines for that improved nutrient use efficiency. However, that is really critical that you have that basic and fundamental understanding that is generated by the academic community to have that. So with basic and fundamental research as well as applied research, there's many different research programs for that, but what I want to kind of now narrow down even into further is one of the producer-directed funding programs called the Canola Agronomic Research Program. So this program has been around for about 3 decades now. This is funded primarily by the 3 provincial grower associations, as well as other co-funders are involved. And what I wanted to really show here is that it is just one of many programs, but taking a look at kind of where is the distribution of these research investments. And so if we were to kind of break it up into some major areas, we can see it's at least a third, closer to a half of investments into diseases. And diseases are definitely one of our major threats. They can cause significant yield losses. It's something that we kind of have to keep up on as resistance becomes overcome and we need to introduce new resistance or maybe new technologies or controls to manage that. And then the next section is our insects. And so, we have flea beetles as a major investment, multiple insects, looking at variety ones, and that can include potential emerging threats. We're talking about yesterday about the cabbage seed pod weevil going into different areas, as well as maybe even Swede midge, continuing to monitor for that in case we need to have that base understanding to address that threat if it arrives. So one thing I do want to note here too is that CARP is an annual funding program, and with that provides a little bit of flexibility or maybe dynamism in terms of directing investments to areas that need research the most. And so you see, while this funding program definitely has increased in scale across maybe the past few years, maybe 5 years or so, we have 9% of the total funding attributed to verticillium stripe research, which has been recognized as a major threat and something that we need to develop that fundamental knowledge base, and then also in tandem work on some applied research to provide some outcomes for growers. So now we've looked at kind of the research program side of that. Now we can kind of go into historically, whether it's through CARP or whether it was through the AgriScience Cluster, as well as other publicly funded programs, looking at some of these successes of research and finding that if we can identify some of these projects that provide at least that 1% return, then that is definitely a value towards the overall program, the overall investments that we've seen. And so I think a great case of this, and something that has been part of our major extension in terms of plant establishment for the Canola Council of Canada across our prairies, is the 5 to 8 plants per square foot kind of recommendation that we're trying to target to. So there's been many studies, seeding rate studies, to take a look at these plant stands over the years for this. But trying to collate all this information and grab that one sentence, that 5 to 8 plants per square foot. That is the golden sentence that then we can base off a lot of different practices and recommendations in agronomic best management practices to achieve that. And so I wanted to refer just one specific point. This was probably about 15 years ago now. Dr. Steve Shurtleff through CARP, looking at many independent field studies that develops this kind of meta-analysis. There was some open pollinated canola studies along with the hybrid canola studies, and you generate this curve to see, okay, where are you having a significant drop off in yield if you're going below a certain plant stand. This allows us to then have an anchoring point that then we can have further discussions in terms of the impacts of, say, other emerging threats, if it's insect feeding and such, and kind of the risk balance that we need to do on agronomic practices. Another knowledge-based research outcome that we've seen here that's more disease focused is that 2-year gap for clubroot management. And so as clubroot was coming onto the stage in Alberta for this, we needed to develop that knowledge base, the agronomic knowledge base. Okay, how do we deal with this in our current production systems? And so we need to take a look at, the spores in the soil, base that on some rotational studies, and how, depending on the year break, what is that kind of drop off for these spores? So this is one specific example. There have been other studies taking a look at this too. But really, the primary outcome for this is saying, if you have clubroot as a risk in your area, having a 2-year break reduces that risk, preserves your yield, and then also, in addition to this is a key mitigation strategy that can be layered on in terms of adopting clubroot-resistant varieties as well. So as we're kind of developing that in that applied research context and getting those products to development, having that understanding and knowledge on the agronomic level was really important to kind of keep our production moving along. And my last example for a knowledge-based research outcome that we've seen, and this was through the Canola Agri-Science Cluster through CAP, and I believe also growing forward too, so the previous iteration before that, was the action threshold to spray is at 25% defoliation. And so as an extension material produced by the Canola Council, we have this infographic saying, okay, if you're reaching the 25%, this is the time to spray. If you're reaching 50%, then that is your economic yield loss potential that you'll start to see those impacts. And so while I think we definitely want to spray for these flea beetles, we know that it's a threat, especially after seed treatment eventually wears off. What we want to think about is the responsible stewardship of some of our chemicals, as well as the responsible stewardship of our profitability, that if we can reduce our one insecticide application, or at least time that application properly, that's either keeping dollars in a grower's pocket or being able to spend it to preserve that yield potential. Looking at more of the technology-based research, which if you were to take a look at kind of a good chunk of what we've been seeing recently in these funding programs, is taking a look at developing that genetic basis and understandings for resistance. And so I wanted to highlight this one, and I know University of Alberta has mentioned this multiple times, and people that have been around during the adoption of the quantum blackleg resistant cultivars had a major benefit, because we were seeing a rise in blackleg infection here, and I believe in Ali Reza's presentation too, we're starting to see a gradual rise as well again. But the robustness of, say, major gene resistance preserved a lot of the yields, and I think is a really good way that we can show that the responsiveness of some work from these public institutions has saved a lot of productivity and allowed us to kind of keep on that upward trajectory. And then the next one too, I just want to talk about, because it's kind of in a different phase of this innovation continuum, is a novel biopesticide against Sclerotinia. And so just quickly highlighting here, it's a microbial formulation and that was developed from the late Dr. Sue Boyachko and taken up by Dr. Tim DeMonso through CARP, that screened a panel of microbes and found ones that showed good efficacy in growth chamber studies, and applying this to a susceptible cultivar and showing that there's actually really good protection against that. So right now it's on that innovation continuum to try and do the evaluations and further formulation development by industry. But I think it's really good to consider here, because while we do have a lot of other tools, crop protection tools, namely fungicides right now, to protect against Sclerotinia, it's important to have other opportunities in our toolbox to actually implement in case it's a regulatory issue in terms of application of these products, or also potentially sclerotinia resistance to some of these products as well, which was noted in Doug's research update as well. That's being funded through CARP and the Agroscience Cluster. So thinking about it on now the grower's investment in terms of these levy payments to invest into this research, it does have quite incredible value as we're talking about the continuum of public investment, private investment, government investment, and how these dollars through some of these research programs that we come together as a group can act as signal dollars to show and communicate these priorities for these areas. So we talk about emerging threats, such as verticillium, that we can kind of start to stimulate research bases, develop the knowledge, and then apply that later, and then allow that to be taken up by private industry. It also provides opportunities for leverages for the other funding groups. And so we've seen in a previous chart here how through the Canola Agroscience Cluster as an agricultural partnership kind of framework, we see that we can kind of pool dollars together, whether it's from the industry, public sector, as well as the government, to achieve some of these larger projects that now we can have, say, that $3.9 million per year. So bringing it on even further down into the farm gate level, and we're in Saskatchewan here, so I'm using the example for the 75 cents a ton levy from Sask Oilseeds. If we were to have a 10,000 acre farm, say 5,000 of that is canola, and a conservative estimate maybe this year at 40 bushels an acre, and at $600 a ton, that's about 0.125% of canola revenue. And I think previously we were talking about the GRDC, it was about 1% and all that. So it's almost a factor of 10 there in terms of the investment we're seeing, but we can definitely realize the value of that investment as it translates into some of the outcomes we've talked about. So talking about some of these strong ROIs to the farm gate, we highlighted about changing the plant stand targets to 5 to 8 plants per square foot compared to maybe a higher seeding rate recommendation earlier. Now seeding costs have been higher. You know, there's a lot of technology in that seed, but importantly, it's about preserving the profitability and being responsible with that seed. So that way every seed is actually being utilized to the best of its ability rather than wasting it if it's competing against its own self. If we didn't have any blackleg resistance for this, you know, and it's in a severe situation, that's could be up to 50% yield loss. And so having a robust research system to understand major gene as well as minor gene resistance and integrate that into our lines provides a lot of protection for that, and that can easily exceed that extra 1% that we're kind of targeting or talking about. Similar thing with the action threshold for flea beetles. One less insecticide spray, that's money in the pocket, or preserving that yield if you do need to spray for that, because you will recognize those returns. And then also just another mention too, you know, kind of forward future looking, if we're looking at gene edited varieties, cultivars that can provide significant yield boosts. We had a flash talk presentation taking a look at starch branching enzymes and how we can see a potential 25% yield boost on top of this. And so if we're finding some of these kernels of progress throughout the way, it definitely sets the stage up for better developments down the future for productivity. And so this wasn't staged before because I had the 1% example. Same with you, Richard. But so if that is a yield profit boost, or if it's a yield protection, in this particular case, that's a $32,500 return back to the farm in just one season. So you could look at it a different kind of ways, where if we have one project that gives us that boost, that could pay for essentially 10 years of that levy payment that you get back quite quickly. And of course, not all projects do provide that return, but there are some indirect benefits that we can realize through that, whether it's building up that knowledge base, could be adopted in a different way, or potentially in terms of the time scale that we're taking a look at, it may not just have to be realized yet. You know, we're kind of setting aside some of this technology, this understanding for a later day when we actually need it. And then last thing too, even beyond the farm gate, a lot of these investments do provide some other additional benefits. And so developing that research capacity to address emerging threats. So I mentioned Swede midge and verticillium stripe earlier. Ensuring that we have the research capacity to be able to respond quickly enough in time is important. developing highly qualified personnel to enter both the public and private sectors as well. So whether they're graduate students that are going to transfer that expertise to go into the private industry, or going to stay and establish research programs, or work on projects that are of value down into the future. It's important to set ourselves up, because you can't start from zero in some cases. And then lastly, too, when we're talking about all this and the advocacy and communication for this investments and the value that it does have, hopefully we can kind of get to a point where now we can start taking a look upwards. I think there's going to be some strong alignments in terms of opportunities we can see, what we can actually communicate forward in terms of talking to taxpayers, talking to our neighbors, talking to our producers, and our industry at large, advocating that there is an opportunity here and that we can probably get aligned together to continue pushing forward for this. So that kind of wraps up things for myself, and I'll open it up for questions. I don't know how much time we have.
We got 3 minutes for questions. So we got one in on Slido. We'll see if you can answer this. Where does research on field scale precision agriculture fit in the AIC model, where the ideas, environmental impact, and concepts are not clearly quantified?
Yeah, that is a challenging question. So if I'm understanding this right, so you're taking a look at realizing the benefits from a certain technology of this precision work for that. So I think in terms of this context, the return on investment to the farm may not necessarily be a profitability angle for this in terms of increasing supply for the farm too. There's going to be other impacts to that in terms of the whole industry scale, in terms of maybe potentially driving demand as we're taking a look at lower carbon feedstocks, if we're looking at, say, renewable fuels, or potential benefits of reduced emissions. Was it specifically on precision?
That's all I got for you.
Okay,
Yeah, it said, where does research on field scale precision agriculture fit?
Yeah.
I do believe it can be one of those drivers that gives you a significant return on investment. I think the big question that we're all going to be trying to grasp with over the next while is, how do we actually deploy some of that on the field, given the time constraints of planting, harvesting, etc., and the data management. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question well either, but I think it's going to have a high return on investment if we deploy this technology.
Yeah, and just the last comment to that as well, when you're taking a look at precision technologies for that, looking at it at a field scale level is kind of a necessity for that. It's not something that you can take a look at maybe some fertility studies on small plot. So to be able to advance that research on field scale is going to be really critical.
Okay, I have one quick one of my own, and I just thought of this as you were talking. So you talked about the basic fundamental research, and then there's the applied research. Basic fundamental research broadens the knowledge base. That's one of the things you said. And I think that's where, if we're going to innovate, that's probably where the innovation is going to come from. What percentage of our projects would you qualify as or classify as basic or fundamental research?
That's a really good question, because I think you can achieve some of these basic fundamental research in the same time as doing some applied research in specific projects. Whether it's being funded through CARP or cluster or other mechanisms, there's opportunities to develop your knowledge base on this, as well as doing that applied angle for it. In terms of a percentage ratio for that, I think it's going to also depend on where we're at in terms of understanding of some of these systems. So maybe in a more mature research theme, such as Clubroot in Canada, where we've done a lot of base research but can still be growing, and now we're getting to the integration of the resistant cultivars into our lines. Maybe it's going to be a little different than, say, in verticillium stripe, where we're definitely more earlier on that time scale. So I think you have to be kind of dynamic in terms of understanding that, and then also it usually is reflected in our research priorities and consultation with our industry at large.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you.
place here. Okay, we're now going to have yeah, I think that wraps up this session if I'm looking at my notes correctly here. So now we're going to move into a networking break, coffee break, along with our networking break. So hopefully this session has sparked a whole lot of interest and discussion for questions, further discussion, and sets the stage for a lot of the discussion that we can have both informally and formally as we move along. So we'll be back in, I guess, about 15 minutes, 10:45, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning just prior to, so we can start the next session on time.